One moment, he's the Pope, smiling, full of life. Next, he's gone. No warming, no autopsy, just 33 days in power before his reign ends in silence. The Vatican says natural causes, whispers screaming a murder. So, was it fate, a coincidence, or something we haven't found any answers to? Before the world whispered about conspiracy, before the Vatican sealed the truth behind closed doors, there was Albino Luciani, a humble priest from a small Italian village. Albino Luciani was never meant to be a pope. Born on October 17, 1912, in the small Italian village of Forno di Canale, later renamed Canale da Gordo, he grew up in poverty. His father was a socialist bricklayer who worked in Switzerland, sending home whatever little he could earn. His mother, a deeply religious woman, instilled in him the values of faith, humanity, and kindness. Unlike the powerful and influential men who usually climbed the church's ranks, Luciani's early life was marked by simplicity. From a young age, Albino was drawn to the church. At 11, he entered the minor seminary, showing an early passion for theology and philosophy. But he wasn't just a scholar. His kindness set him apart. He was warm, approachable, and genuinely loved by those around him. His laughter was infectious, and his words were gentle. He wasn't a man of power, but a man of the people. By 22, he was ordained a priest, and over the years he quietly rose through the church, always staying true to his simple, unpretentious nature. While others in the Vatican were known for their political maneuvering, Luciani remained focused on the faith. He was not ambitious, and yet, he never sought power. Power found him. If he was a man of humility and faith, why did his raise through the church make some within the Vatican disturbed? In 1958, Pope John XXIII appointed him as the Bishop of Vittorio Veneto. He was reluctant, feeling unworthy of such responsibility, but he accepted. Over the next decade, he became known for his compassionate leadership. He refused the luxuries that came with his position, choosing to live modestly. He even suggested selling the church's treasure to help the poor, an idea that made some within the Vatican uneasy. Then, in 1973, he was appointed Patriarch of Venice, a position that placed him in the higher ranks of the Catholic Church. Even then, he never changed. He remained humble, earning him the nickname, the Smiling Pope. People adored him, but behind the scenes, not everyone shared their admiration. His vision for a church of simplicity, one that focused on the people rather than politics, wasn't welcomed by all. So when Pope Paul IV died in August 1978, Luciani wasn't seen as a strong contender for the papacy. He wasn't political or even powerful. But still, during the conclave, something unexpected happened. On the first day of voting, he received only a handful of votes. But on the second day, something shifted. More and more cardinals began supporting him. Perhaps they saw in him what the people saw, an honest, kind-hearted man who could restore faith in the church. Was it truly destiny that placed him on the papal throne, or was there an unseen force guiding his path? On August 26, 1978, after 4 rounds of voting, Albino Luciani became Pope John Paul I. He had never wanted the role. He even tried to refuse, but the decision had been made. And so, the simple, smiling priest from a small Italian village became the leader of the Catholic Church. He stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, and the world saw his signature warm smile. But behind that smile, there was something else. Hesitation, uncertainty. He knew the Vatican was filled with power struggles, corruption, and secrets. And now, he was at the center of it all. He had plans that would change everything. But just 33 days later, before he could do anything, he was gone. How does a seemingly healthy pope die just into his reign? Was it really natural? Or something disturbing which stayed a mystery even after decades? From the moment Pope John Paul I took office, the Vatican corridors were filled with whispers. He had always been a man of simplicity, but now, in the most powerful position in the church, his humility was unsettling to many. He denied the papal coronation, choosing a simple inauguration instead. He rejected the traditional throne, insisting on being closer to the people. He spoke of reform, of transparency, of dismantling the layers of secrecy that had built up over centuries. But not everyone welcomed these changes. In the final days of September 1978, tension was building behind the Vatican's closed doors. The new pope was starting to ask difficult questions, especially about the Vatican Bank, a financial institution rumored to be entangled with the mafia. He had been reviewing documents, meeting with trusted advisors, and making notes. According to some sources, he had a list of names, high-ranking clergy members he planned to remove. Despite his gentle demeanor, Pope John Paul I was not naive. He confided in close associates that he was troubled by what he had discovered. He spoke of his concerns about corruption and hinted at major matters. Something seemed off. People around him noticed that he appeared exhausted, that he had trouble sleeping, and some claimed he was unwell, but there was no official record of any serious health issues. If he was in good health, then what truly happened that night? An innocent tragedy, or was there a dark secret that was never meant to be on the surface? On the evening of September 28th, the Pope held what would be his last meeting, a routine discussion with several Vatican officials. He seemed calm, though deep in thought. After dinner, he retired to his room, as he always did, with his notes and a book. It was an ordinary night in the Vatican, or at least it should have been. He was reportedly in good spirits despite the weight of the church resting on his shoulders. But the next morning, everything changed. At around 9:30 p.m., the Pope retired to his bedroom in the papal apartments. He had a book with him, The Limitation of Christ, and some handwritten notes, believed to contain details of upcoming changes he planned for the Vatican hierarchy. He had spent days rewriting financial documents and discussing his concerns with closer advisors. At some point during the night, something happened, and that's where things get very interesting. By 4:30 a.m. on September 29th, Sister Vincenza Taffarel, one of the nuns assigned to the papal household, noticed that the Pope had not emerged for morning prayers. It was unusual. John Paul I was known to be punctual, and he never missed his routine. As she grew concerned, she knocked on his door, but there was no response. After a brief hesitation, she entered. What she saw would remain a point of controversy for decades. The Pope was sitting upright in bed, still in his white papal nightgown. His reading lamp was on, and glasses were perched on his nose, and in his hand was an open book. His expression was peaceful, almost as if he had simply fallen asleep while reading, but he was not breathing. His body was cold, and he had been dead for hours. The panic spread through the Vatican. Sister Vincenza immediately alerted his personal secretary, Father Maggi, who then informed Cardinal Jean Villot, the Vatican Secretary of State. Within minutes, the papal apartments were locked down. The Vatican's official statement was released later that morning. It was simple. Pope John Paul I had died of a heart attack during the night. No foul play, no autopsy. Case closed. But almost immediately, questions arose. The first inconsistency was about who had found the body. The Vatican initially claimed that Father Maggi had discovered him, but it was later revealed that Sister Vincenza had been the first to enter the room, and that detail alone raised questions, because in the Vatican, a nun was never supposed to enter the Pope's private chambers alone. Why did they have to lie and alter the death timeline? What were they trying to hide from the world? And that was only the beginning. After that issue came about the missing documents. When Sister Vincenza found the Pope, he had been holding papers. Some suggested they were related to the church reforms he was planning, possibly even a list of names he intended to remove from power. However, when Vatican officials arrived, those documents were gone. No one could explain what had happened to them. Perhaps the most disturbing detail was the refusal to conduct an autopsy. The Vatican stated, under church law, autopsies were not performed on popes, a claim that was only partially true. In the past, popes had undergone examinations, though not full autopsies. Why was there such urgency to declare the cause of death without further investigation? As the suspicion grew, people whispered that Pope had been poisoned, digitalis, a drug known to cause heart failure while leaving little trace. And it was one of the theories. Others pointed to the Vatican's deep financial and political entanglements, suggesting that John Paul I had uncovered something dangerous. And then there was the timing. He had been Pope for just 33 days. He had barely begun his work, and just as he was about to shake the foundations of the church, he vanished. Pope John Paul I's sudden death left the world with more questions than answers. A healthy man, gone without warning. No autopsy, missing documents, conflicting accounts. It wasn't long before theories of foul play began to spread. If Pope John Paul I's death wasn't natural, then who stood to benefit the most from his sudden passing? And what hidden motives drove them to silence him? At the heart of these theories were three powerful groups, each with their own reasons to fear John Paul I's reforms: the Vatican Bank, the Mafia, and the Vatican hardliners. John Paul I was different. He wanted a church that served the people, not the powerful. His vision was simple: strip away corruption, remove those abusing their positions, and make the church more transparent. But this put him at odds with the Vatican's most powerful figures, those who had built their influence over decades. One of the names that appeared in conspiracy theories was Cardinal Jean Villot, the Vatican's Secretary of State. Villot was deeply entrenched in the church's bureaucracy, and some believe he saw the new pope as a threat. It's alleged that John Paul I had a list of officials, possibly including Villot, whom he planned to throw out. Villot was also the first official to enter the pope's room after his body was discovered. And strangely, some of John Paul I's personal belongings, his reading glasses, slippers, and even his last notes, were never found again. Did Villot secretly remove crucial evidence before the public learned the truth? Why were Pope John Paul I's belongings missing after his sudden death? If John Paul I's death was an assassination, the Vatican Bank scandal might have been the real reason behind it. At the center of this scandal was Bishop Paul Marcinkus, an American archbishop who ran the Vatican Bank. Under his leadership, the bank was linked to illegal financial dealings, including money laundering and fraud. John Paul I had taken a keen interest in the bank's affairs. He had started investigating its connections with Banco Ambrosiano, an Italian bank controlled by Roberto Calvi, a man later known as God's banker. Calvi had close ties with both the Vatican and the Mafia. The deeper the Pope looked, the more corruption he uncovered. He was preparing to remove Marcinkus and restructure the bank entirely. But after the Pope's death, Marcinkus remained in charge of the Vatican Bank for another decade. Was Pope John Paul I's sudden death a mere coincidence? Or did his plans to expose Vatican corruption make him a target for powerful enemies? The Vatican Bank's corruption wasn't just about missing money. It had deeper ties to organized crime. The Italian Mafia, specifically the Sicilian Mafia, had used the Vatican Bank to launder millions of dollars. They had a vested interest in keeping things as they were. One of the most notorious figures in this conspiracy was Michele Sindona, a Sicilian banker with deep relations to both the Mafia and the Vatican. Sindona had been involved in money laundering schemes that funneled illicit funds through the Vatican Bank. It is believed that John Paul I's plans to investigate the Vatican's finances could have exposed Sindona's network. But Sindona had close ties to Propaganda Due, a secretive Masonic lodge involved in political manipulation, financial fraud, and even assassination. As the theories suggest that if the Mafia was involved in the Pope's death, they could have used P2's connections within the Vatican to make it happen. Each of these groups had something to lose if Pope John Paul I continued his reforms. The Vatican hardliners wanted to protect their power, the Vatican Bank's leadership wanted to bury their corruption, and the Mafia wanted their money to keep flowing. Pope John Paul I's reign was the shortest in modern history, just 33 days. Yet, in that brief time, he left behind a legacy that still lingers. He was known as the Smiling Pope, a man of humility who sought to bring warmth and sincerity back to the Church. His refusal to indulge in the grandeur of the papacy made him beloved by the public, but it also made him a threat to those who thrived in the shadows of power. And despite the official explanations of his death, a heart attack, doubt has never truly faded. The denial to conduct an autopsy remains one of the most unsettling aspects of his story. If his death was truly natural, why was there such urgency to close the case? Why were his personal belongings, even his notes on Vatican reforms, never recovered? Over the years, various figures involved in Vatican affairs have spoken out, but no definitive proof has ever surfaced. Michele Sindona, the banker with Mafia ties, was later convicted of financial crimes and poisoned in prison. An eerie voice of the fate some suspect befell John Paul I. Roberto Calvi, the Vatican's corrupt financier, was found hanging beneath London's Blackfriars Bridge in what was officially ruled as he killed himself, but was widely believed to be a murder. And what about the men inside the Vatican? Cardinal Villot, who was rumored to have taken the Pope's papers, remained in power for years. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the head of the Vatican Bank, escaped prosecution and lived comfortably until his death. The system John Paul I had hoped to make remained largely untouched. His successor, Pope John Paul II, carried forward many of his pastoral ideals, but never pursued the deep internal reforms that John Paul I had intended. Whether this was due to personal choice or external pressure remains a mystery. Today, the story of Pope John Paul I is often overshadowed by the popes who followed him. But for those who study the history of the Vatican, his sudden death remains an open wound, a case that was never fully solved, A man who may have died for trying to do what was right. But the questions are still unanswered, buried within the walls of the Vatican, where secrets are kept and mysteries remain. Was Pope John Paul I's death a natural tragedy or something far more sinister? Was he silenced before he could change history? Let us know in the comments. And if you think this was chilling, don't miss the horrifying case of Jean Van Clack. Until then, stay sharp and keep questioning everything.